Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about connecting databases, especially MySQL databases, to our PHP project. In this video, we'll also create a form which a user can submit data which will get inserted into our database. So you can see how that works as well. Anyways, let's just get right into it. We'll open up XAMPP and I'm going to start my Apache server and the MySQL server. Both are green, so that means they're up and running. Another way you can check if they're up and running is by just having localhost. Obviously this will launch up our XAMPP dashboard. And at the top in the navbar, you should see phpMyAdmin. Click on that. If it loads something like this, we know that phpMyAdmin is working and our database connections work. Perfect. Let's head back into our VS Code and then start writing some code. So first, I'm going to write an index.php file, which will obviously be our root of our project. First, I always like to run this check where I echo out some code, or I echo out a little hello world to make sure everything is working correctly. So back in my browser, I'm going to go to php-mini course, and hello world is echoed back to us, which means our PHP is perfectly working. So today we'll be connecting a PDO connection to our PHP project. Now, PDO stands for PHP Data Objects. It's the way the MySQL will work with the PHP. There are other ways you can obviously connect to a MySQL database using MySQLi connections, which are fairly simple, but PDO is my go-to. Of course, you can read more about it inside of the PHP documentation. Anyways, I'm going to create a new file here, which are going to be called database.php. I'm going to open up my PHP tags, and inside of here, I'm going to create the connection to my database. As in the previous tutorial, we went over object-oriented programming and storing stuff inside of objects or classes. I'm going to be using classes here and to manage our database in general. So I'm going to create a class, database, and inside of here, I'm going to give it some private properties. So the first one will be our server name. Now a server name is where our MySQL connection is running, which is on our local host. Then I'm going to add a variable for our database name. Now this we'll get back to. So I'm going to put a little to-do here. Then we're going to create another property for our username, which is the username of wherever your MySQL is. By default, it should be something like root. And finally, we're going to need something like a password, which for me is nothing because I didn't set a password for my database connection. With that, we have everything, well, except for our database name, that we can use to connect to our database. So let's get started on creating the database name, or the database in general. Head on over back to, I'm going to create a new tab, localhost phpMyAdmin. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. So in phpMyAdmin, you should see on the left-hand side something like this. You might have less than me. I've only got a couple databases here, but here's where you manage and create your databases. So to create a new database, you'll click on this new here, and this window will pop up where you can type in a database name. For this course, I'm going to type in PHP mini course. Obviously, feel free to call it whatever you want. Now we can get back to this part later, but the most important thing is to remember this name here, because that is what we're going to be putting in here. So for me, PHP mini course. Perfect. Now we have everything we need to connect to our database. To do so, I'm going to be using a function. So private function connect, and connect's better than connection, which will return void. Now I want to store my connection somewhere, and the best place to store it is as a property of our database class. This means we'll add one final one here, which will be a private PDO now, which I'm just going to call connection, or just con. This is where our PDO connection will be stored, so we can access it later on in the project. So now let's create a connection and store it inside of our new con variable. So I'll open up a try block and I'll catch a PDO exception. A PDO exception is thrown anytime the connection to MySQL fails from our project. Simply, all I'm going to do here is just exit with a message, such maybe like database connection error, and then just append on the message we can get from the error. Get message, just like that. Now, instead of our try block, let's actually create the connection to our database. So this con, because we're going to be storing it inside of our private PDO connection, will be a new PDO, but we first need a DSN. So our DSN goes like this: MySQL host is equal to, I need to surround these inside of double quotations. So then we can use these PHP's templating. And inside of here, I'm going to put this and our server name, semicolon, DB name is equal to this DB name. That's all for our DSN. Then the other parameters that are required are this username and this password. That's as simple as it gets to our connection. But what we're going to do right here at the end is add some simple attributes. So this con set attribute, we're going to go PDO attr underscore mode, error mode, and PDO error mode exception. And with that, we have successfully created a function to connect to our database. So obviously now we need to use this function. Now, there's a reason I made it private. It's because, yes, you can have it public, but we can also have it private and have it run on the construction of the object. This is where we can use our public function construct, which is our constructor, where I'll call this connect. Now, I don't need to specifically call the connect function every time I create a database class. It will simply just run automatically when the class is created. Perfect. Let's try it out. So I'm going to start off by just adding it over here inside of our index. Require once, and I'll get my database.php file. Then from here, I'll create a variable db, which is going to be a new database. And if everything goes well, we shouldn't throw any exceptions, or we shouldn't exit the program in any way with any error messages. So if you go back to here, refresh, of course nothing shows up, but nothing has seemed to have crashed. This means that our connection is successful. So let's get to building a simple application where we're going to be able to insert form data into our database by submitting a simple form. So let's get to it. I'm going to start off by creating a basic PHP template. I'm going to say forms database tutorial. And inside of here, I'm going to create a form with an input type of text, a name, let's say first name, and make it required. Then I can duplicate that down, and I'm going to give another one, but this one is going to be last name. And then let's also have like an email. And finally an input, which is the type of submit. If you watched the previous form video that I uploaded previously on this course, this all should look quite familiar with you. I'm going to put inside of here our method, which will be post, and our action will go to another file. So we'll go to form, actually let's do manage form.php. Of course, we need to create this file now inside of our root directory, manage form.php, where we'll be able to handle all of our data that we get from our post request. We'll first check if a post request was actually sent. So if server request method was equal to post, then we'll do whatever's inside this block. So I'm going to get our data, but I'm going to check if it's empty. So then we can quickly return and display an error to the user. So we'll check if empty from our post. First, we add our first name, then or if our post last name is empty, or if our email is empty. If any of these are empty, I'm going to simply head back to our index.php and exit the program. But now you're saying, how is that anything to do with error handling? You're just sending them back. The user doesn't know what's wrong. I'm going to use sessions to store our errors. So sessions are very simple. They pretty much store some values. It's a key value pair, which we can then access throughout the whole project. So think of it as like setting some sort of global environment variable. Not exactly, but think of it kind of like that. So to do that, we'll start off by starting our session. To access our sessions, any file, if that wants to use a session, we'll need to have a session start at the top of it. So heading over here, we can now utilize our session, and I'll set our error to invalid inputs. So we can easily access our error inside of our index.php by just accessing from our session with the key error. We're checking if it's set, and if it is set, we get the value and display it to the user. That's how we'll do error handling inside of this project. Anyways, now, as we've got our first name, our last name, and our email, because we made sure they're not empty, which means we know that they are valid, we can then store them inside of variables. So we create a variable, first name, which will be post first name. Then we'll have last name, post last name, and our email, which will be email. Perfect. As we're on the topic of validating data and inputs, we might as well go over validating emails. So to validate an email, you would use the filter var function. Simply, we'll do filter var inside of an if statement with our email variable, and we'll do filter validate email. But this returns true if they are correct. And we want to show an error and return back to our index.php if the email is not valid. So that's where we need to reverse the logic. So we're typing an exclamation mark here. We'll flip the logic. So if it's true, we'll turn it to false. Pretty much saying, hey, if the email is valid now, don't do whatever inside of this if block. Else, if it is invalid, go inside of this if block. And simply, we can quickly copy over what we have up here, as it will be pretty much the same thing, just we can change the error. The error now will be in valid email format. Now, with that, we have all of our data. We've validated that our email is a correct email. We can now insert this data to our database. But we don't have any function to insert data into our database yet. We've only got the database class, which connects to the database. It doesn't do anything with it. So let's head on over back to our database file and create a new function down here, a public function, which I'm going to say insert form data, which will take as a parameter a string of our name, a string of our last name, and a string of our email. And it will return Boolean. Now, why are we returning a Boolean? Well, I want to check if it was successful. So if our insertion of data was successful, we'll return true, else we'll return false if there was an error. And we can manage some error handling inside of our manageforms.php. But before we go on any further, we need to create a table where this data can sit inside of our MySQL. Because at the moment we've just created a database, we haven't created any tables. So I'm going to head on over back to our phpMyAdmin. And this is where it says create a new table, because no tables were found in the database. So for our table name, I'm going to call it form input. And for the number of columns, let's see. We have our first name, our last name, and our email. So it should be 3, right? Well, no, because we need a unique identifier for every one of the entries. Because every time a user submits some data into our database, it will be stored in as a row. But each row needs a different sort of unique identifier. So this is where something like an ID column comes in. Therefore, we're going to need 4 columns, not 3. So let's create that, and I'll show you what we're talking about. So you get greeted with something like this. On the left, the first input will be the name of the column. So let's fill that out. We'll do ID as the first one, our unique identifier. The type will be integer. And don't worry about any of this. The thing we want to care about is the index. Now we'll set the index to primary. This is the primary key. This is what tells the database that, hey, look at this value. This will be unique. And because I want MySQL to manage this ID property by itself, I'm going to enable auto increment, which is what this A_I means. It stands for auto increment. Every time a new row is inserted with data, the ID will be +1 or auto incremented. This next part will look a bit more familiar. We'll add in our first name, which will be a varchar of 255. Varchar is pretty much a way of saying string inside of our MySQL, which is what we're going to be using for now. Last name, which will again be a varchar. I'm going to put the length of 255. And our email, which again will be another varchar. Now, before we click save, let's analyze it again one more time so we know what we're doing. We have 4 columns: ID, first name, last name, and email. ID is a type of integer, which will be the primary key, which is the column that uniquely identifies each row. And we enable auto increment, so MySQL will automatically manage the ID for us by auto incrementing it every time a new row is inserted. And then our first name, last name, and email are all types of string / varchar that have a length of 255. Cool. Let's save that. As you can see, now we get an overview of our structure. Now everything looks correct. So let's head on back over to VS Code, where we can now use this new table and insert some form data to it. I've seen here I put name. Let's put first name, just like that. So create a variable. I'm going to call it SQL, which is going to be our query. So inside of our string, we're going to put in some SQL code. So to insert data, we'll type insert into, then the database name we provided, which for me was form inputs. And inside of brackets, we'll fill in, or we'll say which columns you want to fill the data with. So for me, that was our first name, our last name, and our email. You see how I left out ID? Because I said specifically that I want MySQL to manage the data for us. Then we'll add values. Now our values will be stored as like a variable in a way. You see what I mean in a sec. So first name, last name, and email. And that's our query done. Now what we need to do is we need to prepare this statement and replace these values that are prefixed with colons with our actual parameter values. I'll create a new variable statement, which will be this con, so we access our connection, and we'll prepare our SQL query. And finally, we need to execute this query. So inside of our execute, we can open up an array, which will be our params. This is where we can finally replace these variable placeholders with our actual parameters from our function. So we'll do this as a key value pair. So first will be our first name, which will be the value of our first name from our function. Last name, which will be from our last name. And email, which will be from our email. Perfect. With this code here, we're able to now successfully insert data that is provided to us through our function parameters into our MySQL database. Now I still haven't returned anything, and I'll return right over here. But why am I returning right over here, you might ask? Well, if you hover over the execute function, you can see at the bottom where it says return in the documentation, it returns true on success or false on failure, which pretty much handles the logic I wanted to handle by myself anyway. With that, we now have a function that will let us insert data into the database. So instead of our managed form, include our database. So require once database PHP. I'll create a new variable, database, which will be a new database, which will automatically connect to our database for us. And I'll create a new variable result, which will store the result of our insert function, which will be called for our DB insert form data. I'll pass in the first name, I'll pass in the last name, and I'll pass in the email. Now with the result, I said I was going to do some error handling. So we'll check if our result is equal to false. So if it's false, I want to show an error. So I'm going to copy this code up here. And if there is an error, I will just simply say database error. Else, we'll copy this again, but I will change from error as our key to something like success, where I will now have a success message. So I'm going to say successfully inserted form data. Let's add an exclamation mark as well. And we'll go back to our index.php. Nice. So this is our managed form PHP file, all done pretty much. Now heading over to our index.php, let's actually show the user if there's an error or if we've got a succeeded insert. At the top of the file, as I said earlier, we need to start our session. So I'll put this at the top of the file, session start. And then I'll display our errors below. Inside of our body, I'm going to create a new PHP tag right above our form, where I will check if is set our session error. So if there is an error set, I will then echo out inside of a span the session error. And I need to surround this inside of these curly braces. And finally, I need to unset the session error. And I also need to add a semicolon here, because we just want to display the error once, and after it's displayed, we can just get rid of it. We don't need it anymore. Now, we could do the same thing, but with our success message. So I could put an else if here is set from our session success. I've just copied this code here, and instead of error, we could put success, and we'll unset our success. And for it to look a little bit more pretty, I'll add some basic styling. So by that, I mean simply just changing the color to green. And for the error, let's make it red. Just like that. With that, our index.php is complete. So the only thing left to do is to try it out. So heading over back to our browser, I'll refresh. Actually, let's add some placeholders. We're not finished just yet. Placeholder, where I'll add first name, a placeholder for our last name, and a placeholder for our email. Perfect. Now let's see how that looks. That's much better. So let's actually try and submit some data. So our first name, let's put something like John, a last name of Williams, and an email of john@gmail.com. This is valid data, so everything should hopefully work properly. Submit. We get our nice green message that says we've successfully inserted the form data. And if you head back over to phpMyAdmin, let's zoom out a little bit. If I go to browse, we now have an entry inside of our database, a new row, and with the ID of 1. So this tells us that we successfully submitted the correct data to our database table, and MySQL also manages the ID for us. Now to verify this, we can do another request. Now let's do Mike, with the last name of Johnny. Mike@gmail.com. Submit. We get the same successful message. We'll go back here, and we can refresh by clicking this refresh button up here. We get another row with the ID of 2, which means MySQL does actually append and auto-increment the ID. So what happens if we now try to submit something that's invalid? So let's start off with submitting nothing. Obviously the client will manage that for us. But let's say I was someone malicious and I went into the inspect element and I got rid of all of these required properties here. Now if I click submit, PHP noticed that one or more of our inputs is invalid and gave us this error and put us back inside of our index.php. And if we look back in our database and refresh, nothing new was added. which means the database didn't execute. Perfect. Now let's check the email validation. So if I put a correct name and a last name, and then we quickly change the type from email to text. So now we could put in something like an invalid email, like ha ha ha. And if I click submit now, oh, PHP, using our filter var function, seeing that our email was in the incorrect format. It was in the correct email. And again, it gave us another error and put us back inside of index.php. That showed us this error. Look at that. Now we have just successfully created a secure form and also a database connection where we can manage the data. So that's it for this tutorial. If you enjoyed, make sure to leave a like and subscribe and comment below what you want to see next. Anyways, that's it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.